Hello, welcome to Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. So today I will take a minute from your time, dear listeners, to share my excitement with you because we're celebrating our 100th episode of the podcast, and I am beyond grateful for each and every one of you who have been with us from the early days, patiently listening to our growth. If you remember how we started, then you can definitely tell the difference and the miles that we've traveled together to be where we are today. In these 100 episodes, I've done hundreds of interviews, I've had dozens of guests, and believe me when I say that each and every download, comment and review has motivated me to improve and bring you valuable content. So thank you all for the support, and let's dive into our 100th episode and see magic happen.
Everyone can see that it is inherently wrong that the plastic products that we just use for a couple of seconds and a couple of minutes ends up being in the environment and really harming wildlife in decades and sometimes even centuries.
The current dynamics are wrong, the economics don't add up. Single-use plastic is too cheap. Clearly the system is overflowing, so you need to close the tap, making sure that there doesn't come in a lot more plastic. There's enough plastic out there already.
This week we are talking about the negotiations on the treaty to end global plastic pollution, what has been done, the expectations, and what would a global legally binding plastic treaty mean in practice. We generate over 430 million tons of plastic each year, according to the United Nations Environment Programme. Surprisingly, around 2/3 of this amount consists of short-lived items that quickly turn into waste. Sadly, a significant portion of this plastic ends up in the ocean, posing a threat to marine life and even finding its way into our food chain. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development warns that global plastic waste is projected to nearly triple by 2060. Shockingly, less than 1/5 of this waste is recycled, while about half of it goes to landfills. To tackle this, a United Nations committee convened in Paris from the 29th of May until the 2nd of June to work on a groundbreaking treaty aiming at ending global plastic pollution. The committee, known as the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee for Plastics, is responsible for developing the first international legally binding agreement on plastic pollution, with a specific focus on marine environments. This was the second meeting out of 5 scheduled to finalize the negotiations by the end of 2024. During the first meeting held in Uruguay 6 months ago, different countries expressed varying preferences regarding global mandates, national solutions, or a combination of both. The meeting in Paris attracted more than 2,000 participants, including representatives from governments and observers, hailing from nearly 200 countries. The treaty options for addressing plastic pollution can be simplified into 2 main approaches. One approach, supported by the High Ambition Coalition led by Norway and Rwanda, emphasizes human health and environmental protection. It includes limits on plastic production, restriction on certain chemicals used in plastics, and aims to end plastic pollution globally by 2040. This approach also focuses on restoring biodiversity and tackling climate change. The alternative approach, favored by some plastic-producing and oil and gas exporting countries such as the United States, Saudi Arabia and China, has a narrower focus. It concentrates on tackling plastic waste and increasing recycling efforts. Proponents of this approach argue that national plans would allow governments to prioritize the most significant sources and types of plastic pollution. Many plastics and chemical companies also support this approach as it prioritizes recycling in a potential plastic waste treaty. So how serious is the plastics problem?
Plastic pollution is one of the fastest growing global environmental problems. It is indeed an accelerating problem.
Eirik Lindebjerg is Global Plastics Policy Lead at World Wildlife Fund, WWF.
Plastic production has increased exponentially and continues to to increase and will continue to increase going forwards according to the business as usual estimates. That has led to, first of all, nature almost approaching a saturation point of plastics, while some decades ago, even if some plastics leaked into the environment, it was difficult to notice. Now it is everywhere and it is causing severe damage to ecosystems. We have identified plastic pollution in all ecosystems around the world. It is detected in the Arctic sea ice and the deepest depths of the ocean. And it is really now reaching a scale where it has massive ecological impacts. It also has important human health impacts, the largest being in many developing countries where open burning of plastics is causing toxic air pollution, open dumps, pollution of drinking water as a result of accumulation of plastic waste. It's also a serious human health concern, and increasingly we're also seeing the effect on humans directly, either from using plastics or ingesting plastics directly or through the animals that we are then eating.
Why is it taking so long to find solutions and to witness proper action being taken?
I think a major problem is that current regulation in most countries of the world is really benefiting the status quo and a linear economy, an economy that is basically based on rapid increase in production and consumption of plastics and single use to a large degree of those plastic products. We know that the solutions exist. There are lots of different exciting alternative business models, and in particular around reuse, that is perfectly possible to implement. This crisis doesn't really need any new technology development or advanced research. It's really often very simple solutions that are ready. Lots of startups, lots of bigger businesses as well have the solutions ready. Sometimes it's even just going back to practices that worked for decades before they were replaced by single-use plastics. So it is possible to change, but the problem really is that plastics is too cheap, too easy to use for the industry, and the regulation is not there in place in order for those alternative business models to really scale up.
Although there are initiatives on local and governmental level, the most important obstacle to tackle plastic pollution is the fact that we use multiple kinds of plastics.
Plastics is not just one type of material. There's actually so many different types of plastics and materials related to it.
Willemijn Peeters is CEO and founder of Searious Business, a company that aims to prevent plastic pollution.
Plastics is not just the toys and the plastic items you see around you, like your phone, your laptop, but it's also packaging, it's also tires and paints, and it's in your clothing, and it's in many different applications. So it's quite hard to put them all in a one-size solution box. You need different types of solutions to make sure that the plastics can actually have another use and maybe recycled at the end of life and then reused again. So there's a lot of different types of solutions needed, and sometimes the best solution is not to use any plastics in the first place, because you will lose the material during use. So it's a different set of measures that are needed to make sure that we can keep using plastics in a vital way, not having plastics leak into our environment and into our air, body, water, soil, everything else. So I think that's where a lot of different players come in that each have a piece of the solution. So governments can play a role in determining strict regulations, businesses can play a role in changing the way they produce, and consumers can play a role in the way they consume.
Now, the European Commission has made a step towards the right path by introducing its Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive, which lays down measures to prevent the production of packaging waste and to promote reuse of packaging and recycling and other forms of recovering packaging waste. It also sets out the requirements that all packaging placed on the EU market must meet. These provisions are designed to reduce the disposal of packaging waste and to promote a more circular economy. For Eirik and Willemijn, this is an important initiative that sets the tone on what regulations countries can follow if it is reinforced properly.
I think that can be a very important step forwards if it's not watered down, of course, before it is finally adopted. I think that regulation is really an attempt to create a better environment for reuse models, for alternative business model, and to create that market shift that is needed. I think in particular, it is potentially an important global step forward if it includes strong reuse targets for all sectors. And overall, I think it also is important that it leads to a general reduction in packaging waste. I think the system that we see today is very much based on single use of packaging and an accumulation of plastic waste. That's a big problem in Europe, and that Europe also exports to other countries. So if the Commission's regulations as the first draft stands, if that is implemented, I think it is a significant way forward. But then it is really important that it is not watered down and become more of a symbolic regulation than actually creating that necessary market shift.
I really like that initiative from the European Commission to bring together all the countries in Europe to at least assemble one voice, to have one voice in saying, okay, how in this region we would like to address the challenge of plastic pollution. I think through all the influence of especially industry players, you see a bit of watering down of those commitments and ambitions. But still, I think it's a very good set of measures that will create a clear view of what the European Union is interested in pushing for. So having more sustainable production, especially within the European Union.
Of course, as every legislation, this one will be met with resistance from different countries or different multinational companies that want to preserve their interests.
Mostly there's resistance if there's other interests at stake, which are typically industry interests. Obviously, governments are supposed to speak on behalf of their population and be in the general interest of the general public, play a role of being a custodian of the environment. But at the same time, they want to make sure that people keep having relevant jobs and they can create enough welfare. It's just that I think the conventional way of doing business is no longer needed in the future. So we really have to shift to other types of producing in the future, where it's much more towards a circular economy. And I think this regulation from the European Commission is a really good start because it is mandatory. So it's regulation is not the directive where you can have national interpretations. No, this regulation stipulates what the member states need to do. And that will also create a level playing field in terms of policies. So it will be easier through the European Union to have the same type of rules and the same type of doing business, which will make it easier for other countries to not lose any jobs, but to start moving into new types of jobs that will actually make sure that materials are being kept in a loop.
You're listening to Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. Subscribe to our podcast newsletter on euractiv.com/newsletters. And if you want to expand your knowledge in other fields, you can listen to our tech, agri-food and health podcast. And if you have any comments or ideas, you can drop a line at podcast@euractiv.com. And you both have been following this for years and you have been working on it. And you were both in Paris following the discussions. So what is new now?
Yeah, so in Paris, that was more a very international stage. So it was an international negotiation committee from all the United Nations, so 175 countries. And that was even much broader than Europe. And I think what is unique is that countries come together and try to create a global mandatory framework where especially international companies will have the same set of rules everywhere. And there's no risk of pushing companies in a specific country where there's less legislation. No, the rules will all be the same. And this will also enable investments in better technologies and better systems to make sure that the plastic materials can stay in the loop.
In Paris, we really saw a huge wave of countries calling for specific binding regulations at the global level. It was a clear majority of the countries in the negotiation room that actually called for very specific regulations on, for example, phasing out and banning certain types of the most high risk and harmful plastic products. We saw a call for global product design requirements and also calls for minimum standards on waste and recycling and collection, and a very strong call from developing countries around creating a financial mechanism as part of the treaty to really support implementation in all countries. So there is a strong political will to push this through and create a quite historic global environmental agreement. And that was the positive message, I think, from the Paris negotiations.
For Eirik, the goal of this treaty would be to regulate plastics in a global scale, and all countries would follow the same rules.
I hope that governments really take this once-in-a-generation opportunity to create a global joint approach on plastic pollution, and that we will get a treaty that really regulates plastics at the global scale, creates a minimum standard that producers and consumers in all parts of the world will need to abide by, and that will also benefit from. That we will get a global plastics economy where many of the most harmful uses are not there anymore, being replaced by reuse systems or alternative business models. I think we can get the situation where it is where a product produced in one country can actually be managed, reused or recycled and taken care of in the country where it's exported to, unlike the situation today. So we'll get that common standard globally for plastics, and that would hopefully lead to a proper reduction of the global consumption, in particular of single-use plastics and packaging, so that we don't see these mountains of plastics waste accumulating both in the environment and especially in urban areas in the developing world. So I think it's possible, and I think it will be a hard fight. I think the big support for an ambitious treaty in Paris is a very good starting point. The treaty negotiations are expected to end by end of 2024. There will still be 3 negotiation meetings in Kenya, Canada, and the Republic of Korea. And it will be, I think, a very hard fight in order to achieve. I think all types of mobilization of public pressure on these negotiations will be needed in order to achieve a meaningful outcome that can really transform the plastics economy at a global scale.
While for Willemijn, voluntarily measures are not enough, so to have results, we need strict rules and legislation to tackle the issue.
If you just do it based on voluntary measures, you'll get what we have had now. So industry has not proven to be able to regulate itself quite well. I mean, of all the plastics that were put out in the world, only 9% got recycled. And Most of that was even downcycled, so into construction material. So effective recycling was only 2% of all the plastics that were out there ever. And I think that's the wrong way to go. So you really need to have strict rules and legislation to make sure that companies will all start abiding by the new rules. And I think that there's a lot of promise in this in the future. You see, there's at the moment there's 3 major crises going on. Obviously, we have the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, and the plastic pollution crisis. And in general, people around the world are demanding action from their governments. They can see plastics ending up everywhere, and not just in the air and the water and the soil, but also in their bodies. And it's creating detrimental effects in terms of health issues. So, and this is just beginning. So I think there's a clear and urgent need for more action and less voluntary measures. And the UN Treaty on Plastics has the potential to be that globally binding instrument. So happy to be involved and try to see how companies can get involved, because at least a lot of countries are already quite engaged and seeing the potential and the need for upstream measures to prevent plastic pollution by influencing the way plastic is produced.
But not all is lost. According to Eirik, there are many positive developments in local and international scale and from all corners of our Earth by promoting the use of reused plastics.
I think there are a lot of, for example, reuse systems being put in place. I think the preparations for the Paris Olympics being based largely on reuse, for example, is a good example. I think we see a lot of initiatives at the local scale around reducing packaging, reusable packaging in big events or in stores, in supermarkets. We see a lot of promising regulation happening, not only in the European Union, but we've seen, for example, Rwanda being leading on banning certain types of single-use plastics and plastics bags. The same has Kenya. Bangladesh was one of the first countries to ban plastic bags. So I think there is a lot of opportunity there. The problem is that it hasn't yet come to the necessary scale, and it hasn't happened in a harmonized way. And that's really where this global treaty can play that accelerating force that is needed.
WWF has started its fight against the use of plastic decades ago. Today, they've built a network of cities and countries that aim to eliminate the leakage of plastic into nature by 2030.
We are working to a large extent at the city level in particular in Southeast Asia, but we have an initiative called Plastic Smart Cities, where we collaborate with a lot of local organizations in the countries where we work. Also with several global organizations as well to bring knowledge into that, where we built a network of cities worldwide that is piloting innovative solutions at the city level, sometimes also neighborhood level. Then we're working with businesses around monitoring of their plastics ambitions and promises to reduce use of plastics, for example. And we're working on global legislation and national legislation in many countries. And we have now at the global level particularly engaged in the treaty negotiations, where we are collaborating with an increasing number of both civil society organizations. I think we've seen several hundreds, as much as 1,000 organizations that are joining different initiatives leading up to these negotiations. And we have worked with businesses that really see a need for putting in place stronger regulation globally, and that actively calls for their own sector to be better regulated.
And adding to that, Searious Business is helping companies to turn to reused plastics and to introduce the closed-loop recycling.
Searious Business is more like a game changer. We advise companies on how they use plastics and support them in their implementation. So really help major users of plastic to move away from virgin plastic, depending on hard data, choosing for a different type of material or no material at all. We help them to switch to reuse. And thirdly, we help to set up closed loop or even open loop recycling. So we really make sure that the plastic can stay in a closed loop. And those kind of initiatives are very specific in its kind because it needs experience on material design, it needs experience on design engineering, business modeling, analysis work. But really that cost element is also quite essential. So how do you get to viable reuse systems, for instance? When is it economically interesting to set up a closed loop recycling if there's nothing else being provided, if there's no infrastructure? So how can you set it up and how can you align with different industry players? And this is what Searious Business is helping to facilitate and helping to implement together with major companies from around the world.
So what can we do better on atomic level, collective level, and on policy level?
The current dynamics are wrong. The economics don't add up. Single-use plastic is too cheap. So that also means that there's heavily subsidized. There's heavily subsidies on the use on crude oil and also on the production of virgin plastics. We see there needs to be a cap on virgin plastic production, which will help because now clearly the system is overflowing. So you need to close the tap, making sure that there doesn't come in a lot more plastic. There's enough plastic out there already. For some applications, you need high quality plastics, but for most of them where plastics is used right now, you don't. So you could move to other types of plastic, either recycled content or maybe a bio-based or other materials. So there's a lot of options out there. So we need to cap plastic production and start reducing the amount of plastic is being used in production altogether. And I think you need economic instruments for that. So also moving more to true pricing. So really that the price of a material reflects all the externalized costs it comes with it. Because now, for instance, plastic is really cheap, but all the costs that are involved with dealing with it at the end of life are not incorporated in the price. This is a real problem because it's creating a big issue in the way plastics are being used. You see with the value of metals that they're really being treasured, and you're seeing more and more move towards urban mining. The same goes for we're living in a finite world with finite resources. We need to take care that we can keep our values, keep the material value high, so they can be used again and again.
I think that on plastic pollution, change is really possible. It is an area where there are a lot of interesting opportunities going forwards, if only the politicians and large companies can make that transition and make that change. I think we've seen a huge growth in public demands around plastic pollution. It's really something that everyone cares about, and everyone can see that it is inherently wrong that plastic products that we just use for a couple of seconds and a couple of minutes ends up being in the environment and really harming wildlife in decades and sometimes even centuries. It is a completely unsustainable model, and most people realize that. And I think that public pressure is really what can drive change.
Thank you very much. I am Evik Johori, and this was Euractiv's Beyond the Byline podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, and if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on your favorite podcasting app. This episode was produced by myself with the help of Annie Tubbs. Thank you for listening, and until next week.